healthcare system is broken, but it doesn't have to be. This is Revenue Cycle Optimized by Infinix Healthcare. We discuss the latest challenges in the revenue cycle space and provide actionable tips on how to overcome them at your organization.
I just want to say hello to everyone and welcome you once again to another episode. My name is Stuart Newsom, and I want to thank all of you for joining me today. The topic we're going to discuss is titled Responding to Payor E&M Coding. I always like to state the title so people understand, yeah, I'm in the right place. So if you're here to hear all about how payers are downcoding E&M, then you are in the right place. And this one is a little different today because I'm flying solo. Typically, I have a guest. Maybe sometimes I have one of our clients, one of our subject matter experts on our team, someone who can, and sometimes we do demonstrations of our solutions. But today, this just seemed to resonate with me because I just have a long-standing relationship, love-hate relationship with E&M coding throughout my career. So I thought this resonated also with the industry in healthcare because this is significantly changing some things. This topic lends itself well to the format of having me just speak to you solo about it. So, because what I want to really do is walk through the issue in a very practical way. I want to kind of slow it down and make sense of what's really happening and talk about why it matters, and then spend a little real time on what providers, coding teams, and even compliance leaders and revenue cycle teams can actually do in response. Because this is one of those issues that's on the surface can sound like just another coding topic, maybe even just another reimbursement topic or another claim editing topic, but it's really bigger than that. And I think everyone who's attending today and who's going to listen to this later will realize that. Seems kind of obvious. So what we're seeing right now with Payor E&M downcoding is not just a debate over whether a particular visit should have been a level 3 or level 4. It's really a broader debate over who gets to decide the value and complexity of care, right? And also what information they get to use to make that decision. Who carries the burden when the payer decides to reduce payment before seeing the full story? And that's why I wanted to spend time on it. Because if you're a physician leader or a coder, maybe a compliance professional, practice administrator, or anyone who's involved in the revenue cycle side, this issue touches more than just reimbursement. It touches workflow, it touches staffing, it touches physician education, it even touches trust. And it touches the larger question of whether payment integrity programs are being applied in a fair and clinically grounded way, or whether they're just drifting into cost containment dressed up as coding accuracy. So that's where I want to go today. I want to start with what seems to be happening in the market. Then I want to step back and kind of talk about how we got here because the context really matters. Then I want to talk about the core dispute underneath all of this. And finally, I want to close with what providers can do right now to mitigate the damage and respond in a smart, organized way. So let's start with the obvious question. Why is this suddenly getting so much attention other than the obvious? Well, part of the answer is that this is no longer theoretical. We now have very visible examples of commercial payers putting E&M downcoding programs into motion or drawing scrutiny from how they are adjudicating these claims. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, for instance, is the recent flashpoint because it put a provider notice in writing saying that if the billed level of E&M service is not supported, reimbursement will be made at a lower validated level, and the provider can submit records afterward if they disagree. Now, Cigna has had a similar approach under its R49 policy. And this policy is its review program to certain higher level E&M claims, using claim-based screening to identify the visits it believes may not support the level billed. Now, keywords here are support. I want you to kind of key in on that. Aetna has also been drawn into this conversation, and Anthem in California ran into regulatory pushback strong enough that its policy was paused while it was reviewed by regulators. Meanwhile, Maryland regulators took action against Cigna over automatic downcoding there. So this is not just one isolated plan really to do one odd thing in one state. This is starting to look like a broader commercial payer pattern. Now, to be fair, payers would not describe it the way providers describe it. They would really frame it as coding accuracy, perhaps something like payment integrity. Appropriate reimbursement comes to mind, right? They would say that they're not trying to punish anyone. They're just trying to identify claims where the build level appears inconsistent with the information available on the claim, or inconsistent with coding patterns, or inconsistent with what they view as typical complexity for the diagnosis or services submitted. Cigna, for example, has publicly described its program as using claim-based criteria as an initial screening mechanism and says reconsiderations are reviewed by certified coders. So if we're going to be balanced here, we should at least acknowledge that payers are not publicly saying, we're just trying to keep your money. They're saying this about accuracy. But of course, it's not how it feels on the provider side. So that side is very different. What this looks like for the providers is the claim gets submitted, the E&M gets downcoded during adjudication, payment gets reduced, and only then does the provider have the opportunity to fight it. And that's where the temperature rises, because that changes the order of operation. Historically, the default logic was this: the provider documents the service, submits the code they believe is supported by that documentation, and if the payer believes something is wrong, the payer can deny it, request records, audit it, or otherwise challenge it. That process has never been painless, but at least the medical record is part of the reason or the dispute to show the evidence before payment decisions are finalized or before recoupment is pushed back through. So what feels different now is the appearance that the claim itself is being used as a proxy for the chart. In other words, the payer seems to be saying, based on the diagnosis codes, based on the related services, based on historical claims patterns, based on proprietary editing logic, pick whatever they're basing this on, we think this visit looks too high. So we're going to pay it lower now. And you can come back later if you want to argue with us. And that's why so many people are reacting so strongly, because the medical record is supposed to be the thing that supports the code, not the diagnosis code by itself, not an algorithmic expectation and not a bell curve, not what other people historically have built. It's the actual note. It's the actual clinical thinking. It's the actual work that's done. It's the actual risk. It's the actual time when time is the basis. And that leads to the central question in this whole discussion. What does it even mean for the payer to say the build level is not supported if the documentation was never reviewed at the point they made that judgment? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the issue. Because under CPT and E&M framework, support means support in the documentation. It means support based on medical decision making or total time, depending on how the service was selected. But when a payer makes an intentional reduction without first seeing that documentation, then not supported starts to mean something totally different. It starts to mean not we reviewed your note and found it lacking, but rather your claim did not satisfy our internal front end edit logic. And that's why providers hear that phrase and immediately push back. Now, before we go further, I think it's important to understand the history that sits underneath all of this. Because some of this debate makes no sense if you do not understand what the E&M world used to look like. Now, for years and years, E&M coding was shaped by the 1995 and then later the 1997 documentation guidelines. As a matter of fact, E&M coding really didn't develop until 1992. There were other ways to code visits, yes, but the official evaluation and management codes, well, they came around the early 90s or so. So this was still very young when this documentation guidelines came out. And if you've been in this space long enough, you know exactly what that environment felt like. It was very technical. It was rigid. It was often very frustrating. There was enormous attention paid to documented history and exam elements. And even when a clinician was clearly dealing with a complicated patient, coding teams and providers were often operating in an atmosphere of fear and caution because the rules felt so box driven or so audit sensitive. Now, what did that lead to? Well, from my experience, it led to a lot of confusion, which eventually led to conservatism. And that caused, in many settings, undercoding. Providers often did not trust the process. They did not trust that the complexity of their thinking would hold up cleanly under the old framework. Many defaulted to level threes when level fours may have been appropriate. Some even avoided level fives altogether, almost as a reflex because nobody wanted to invite any scrutiny. So historical claim patterns are not some pristine record of pure coding truth. In many cases, they reflect years of defensive behavior under a flawed and burdensome system. And that matters a lot. because then came the 2021 office and outpatient E&M changes, followed by the broader E&M revisions in 2023. The key shift in 2021, as we all should know, was that history and exam were no longer used to determine the office and outpatient code level, although they still remain clinically relevant and medically appropriate parts of the record. Now, code selection shifted to medical decision making or total time. And that stated goal was to reduce documentation burden and make coding better reflected based on the actual work of caring for the patient. That was a major change. And for many providers, it was also very liberating. Trust me, I've spoken to many providers about this, and I feel their sentiment when this change actually happened. Still a lot of confusion on how to make the adjustment, but it was very liberating. It allowed them to rely more on clinical judgment and less on documentation gymnastics. It made it easier to code the complexity they were actually managing rather than coding to the shape of the template. It encouraged more confidence in billing level fours and fives when they were warranted. And yes, as a result, it should surprise nobody that in some places there was an increase in higher level E&M coding after those changes. Now, does that automatically mean every increase was appropriate? Well, of course not. There are always going to be cases where providers overstate complexity or where documentation does not support what was billed or where organizations need education. But it does mean something important. An increase in level fours and fives after 2021 is not by itself evidence of abuse. Sometimes it may simply reflect more accurate coding under a more clinical rationale for framework. And that's why I think the bell curve issue is so important here. Now, payers have long used what people have often called a bell curve approach, meaning that they look at coding patterns across providers and flag the ones who appear to fall outside the expected distribution of those E&M levels. The problem, in my view, is that those curves are built on historical coding behavior that may not have been fully accurate in the first place. Payers have long used utilization patterns and outlier logic to look for outlier behavior. That's not new. But if your benchmark is built on years of conservative coding from a distorted system, and then the rules change in a way that allows more accurate capture of complexity, your old benchmark may not be a neutral benchmark anymore. It may be a low benchmark. It may be a biased benchmark. And if that's the case, then providers who are coding correctly today might look like an outlier only because the historical curve was artificially suppressed. And that's a problem. Now let's talk about the diagnosis codes, because this is another area where the debate gets muddled very quickly. Diagnosis codes absolutely matter. The problem is the mindset that the principal diagnosis alone tells the whole story of the visit, and it does not. Diagnosis coding can point toward complexity, but has not fully established the medical decision making, the risk, the data reviewed, or the total time that may support the E&M level. A diagnosis code can suggest complexity, but it cannot fully prove medical decision making. It cannot fully show the data reviewed and analyzed. It cannot fully capture the risk management. It certainly cannot prove total time. Even the AMA guidance is pretty clear on this, that the final diagnosis alone does not determine the complexity or risk of the visit. A relatively simple final diagnosis can still sit on top of the complicated evaluation, perhaps some serious concern, medication management, extensive counseling, or complex decision making that only becomes clear when you read the note, the documentation, the medical record, whatever you want to call it. That's important. And that's why the provider response keeps coming back to the same argument. You cannot truly adjudicate an E&M level just from the claim. Now, you can flag it and you can suspect it. You can even question it. You can identify patterns worth reviewing. But to reduce payment with confidence in a way that is clinically defensible, the chart matters. And that's the old-fashioned review process, right? Request the record, evaluate the service, determine whether the level holds. Maybe it does, maybe it does not. But at least then we're dealing with the actual evidence that's in the documentation. What people are reacting to now is the idea that the payers are really taking kind of a shortcut. They look at the diagnosis, they look at the pattern, then they look at the data, and then they compare it to the model. Then they lower the code if necessary based on that model, and then they move on. And from the payer perspective, you can see the appeal of that approach. It's very scalable, it's very efficient, it catches things early, it certainly controls cost, which is the end game, right? and it reduces the need for broader manual review. It probably looks elegant on a spreadsheet, but from the provider perspective, it feels like a black box. And more importantly, it feels like a burden shift because once that lower payment hits, which is a problem in and of itself, the work begins to be put on the provider side. Now someone has to catch it. Someone has to see it in the remittance. Someone has to decide whether it's worth appealing. And then they also have to decide where to pull the note. Someone has to compare, the submitted code and the paid code and make that comparison. Someone has to draft the appeal if necessary, if they want to pursue it. Someone has to wait for reprocessing and then watch cash flow get delayed. And then someone has to absorb all that labor. And that is why this issue is not just a coding issue, it's an operational issue. In fact, one of the most important things to understand about this trend is that it may not depend on being right every time. It may just depend on being right often enough and on enough providers not fighting back. And that's the hard truth. But I think it's part of the reality here. If a payer downcodes a claim and the provider appeals every single one successfully, then the program becomes a lot less attractive very quickly because the administrative costs and the reversal rate become visible. But if a significant percentage of downcodes are never challenged or challenged inconsistently, or are written off because the labor cost of appeal exceeds the incremental reimbursement, then the model works for them. That's what makes this feel like a numbers game. How many providers notice? How many are going to appeal? How many can support the level cleanly? And how many have the resources to fight? And how many small reductions simply get absorbed? And that's where the financial logic of these programs becomes more obvious. Now, let's spend a minute on the legality and the fairness side because I do think listeners will be thinking about that. Now, I'm not an attorney and this is not legal advice, but the market response tells us something important. This is not just a philosophical debate. Regulators and medical societies, I should say, are paying attention to this. We've already talked about Maryland regulators took action against Cigna and required it to stop automatic downcoding there. California also saw enough concern over Anthem's policy that it was paused during the review, and legislation has been proposed there to even prohibit automated downcoding based on claim form information alone. And that tells you there is a real discomfort with the idea that a payer can recode first and make the provider prove the visit later. And honestly, even if something is technically permitted in some settings, that still does not settle whether it's good policy or fair process. Because there are really three different questions here that you need to ask. Is it legal? Is it contractually allowed, which is sometimes the forgotten piece there? And is it right? Those are not the same question. A program can sit in a gray area legally and still be bad process. A program can be an operationally allowed under one contract, but still undermine trust. A program can be marketed as an accuracy while it's still functioning like cost containment. And that's why I think providers need to resist the temptation to make this only a moral outrage story or only a coding technical story. It's really both more boring and more important than that. It's about process design. It's about evidence standards. It's about workflow burden. It's about how risk gets allocated between payer and provider. So let's move to the most important part of the discussion. What can providers actually do? Because no matter how frustrated people are, frustration by itself does not help very much. So let's talk about what providers can do. These next steps come from a mix of the AMA resources, input from groups like the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American Pediatric Medical Association, even regulatory pushback that we've seen in places like California and Maryland, and the real operational issues providers are already dealing with. So the first thing is this. Organizations need to accept that this is not a hypothetical trend anymore. If you are waiting for your own market to become the headline before you prepare, then you're late. Whether your biggest exposure is Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, Cigna, Aetna, another Blues plan, or a different commercial payer altogether, the right move is to assume scrutiny is increasing and build your response accordingly. Second, you have to monitor the remittances closely. Now, I know that sounds very obvious, but it matters. A downcoding program is most effective when it is quiet, when it's not arrived with a dramatic denial letter. It's not announced, so to speak, demanding attention, when it does not screen for that attention, and when it shows up as less money than expected and disappears into the noise of a remittance. And that's where organizations get hurt. So this starts with detection. Know the codes you're submitting. Know the codes you're being paid. Know where line item behavior is changing. Know whether certain payers, specialties, or diagnosis families are overrepresented. Know if moderate and high level visits are getting reduced at unusual rates. If your team can build alerts or work queues around this, then go ahead and do that. If not, then start with trending. Even a simple spreadsheet is better than pretending the pattern will announce itself. Then third, physician and coder education still matters. And I want to be balanced here because even though I'm skeptical of the claim-only downcoding, I do not think that the right response is for most providers and physicians to say, this is all the payer's fault, so we don't need to do anything looking inward. And that would be a mistake because documentation still matters. If medical decision making is the basis, then the record has to clearly show the problems addressed, the data reviewed and analyzed, and the risk of the patient management. If time is the basis, then time has to document it in a way that supports that code. If diagnosis coding is weak, vague, or incomplete, that can absolutely make a claim more vulnerable to scrutiny, even though the diagnosis coding alone should not determine the level. So the defense against inappropriate downcoding is not just appeals. It's also better documentation upstream and better coding that represents that documentation. Not bloated documentation, not box checking, and not 1997 all over again, but clear documentation of thought process, risk, and medical necessity. So name the problems actually managed. Connect the data to the decision. You want to show the risk that you were carrying. Make the note reflect the real clinical complexity. And then fourth, build an appeal playbook. Most of you may already have an appeal playbook, but now you got to fold in this downcoded, E&M downcoded stuff, right? So don't just treat each downcoded claim like a brand new emergency. Standardize the response. Decide what documentation is needed, who reviews it, who drafts the letters, how medical necessity would be articulated, and when is it worth escalating, and decide how outcomes will be tracked. Because one of the most dangerous things about this issue is organizational inconsistency. Now, if one team appeals aggressively and another barely notices and another writes off the variances, you end up with no real visibility and absolutely no leverage. And then fifth, you want to involve compliance and contracting earlier than you might think. This is not just a billing office nuance. If you identify a pattern, you need to know what your contract says. Does it permit this? Does it conflict with prompt pay expectations? Are there state law protections? Are there notice requirements? Are there pattern and practice arguments available if nearly all higher level claims are being re-leveled? Those are not questions to ask after 6 months of leakage. Those are questions to ask as soon as you see a trend. And then six, use your data externally. If you're seeing repeated behavior, bring it to your medical societies. Bring it to your specialty association. You want to bring it to regulators where appropriate, and bring it to the payer relations, and bring it to your network contracting. Bring it to legal counsel even when that's necessary, because individual provider frustration is easy to dismiss, but pattern data, well, that's hard to dismiss. And this is one of the biggest lessons from what we've seen in California and Maryland, because collective response matters, regulatory attention matters, as well as organized pressure. And then seventh, don't forget that the economics of your own response. Not every appeal will make sense to you. Not every downcode will be worth a labor-intensive fight. But if you take that route, be intentional. Know what you are choosing to absorb. Know that what that says about the program's financial impact. Know what percentage of claims you are effectively surrendering because the appeal burden is too high. Because that in itself is part of the story. If a program works mainly because the burden of contesting it is too high, then that should be said out loud. Now, before I wrap up, I want to come back to the balanced view for a moment, because I do think it's important to say this clearly. There are absolutely cases where the documentation does not support the build level. There are absolutely organizations that need better education, as well as providers whose notes do not tell the story clearly enough. And there are absolutely circumstances where the high-level coding increases deserve scrutiny. And that's all true. The problem is not the idea of scrutiny, nor is it the method. The problem is when scrutiny becomes the shortcut and when the claim becomes a substitute for the chart. And the problem is when not supported is asserted before the evidence that is supposed to provide support has actually been reviewed. That is the distinction. And if you keep that distinction clear, you can talk about this issue in a way that is credible, informed, as well as fair. So let me close with the main takeaway that I hope people leave with today. Responding to Payor E&M downcoding is not just about winning appeals. It's about recognizing that the reimbursement fight is moving upstream. It's moving into claims edits, pattern recognition, benchmarking, documentation, quality, remittance surveillance, contracting language, and even organized response. It's about understanding that this is not just a coder problem or a physician problem or a billing office problem. It's a system problem. And the organizations that respond best will be the ones, well, let me just rephrase that. Those who are not going to panic are the ones who are going to respond best. And they'll be the ones that also get things right and get them structured. So they will actually track the downcodes efficiently. They will educate their clinicians. They will tighten the documentation that actually matters. They will watch the remittances more closely, looking for those downcoding patterns as one of those criterias. They will standardize their appeals process or fold in the downcoded instances into that appeals process. They will involve compliance and contracting. They will escalate patterns when needed. And they will not let quiet reimbursement erosion become the new normal, because that's really what's at stake here. Not just whether one claim was paid at the wrong level, but whether the industry gradually accepts a process where the provider's code is no longer treated as the starting point to be reviewed, but as a suggestion to be overridden by software unless the provider invests time and labor to win it back. And that is a very different world. And I think that that's why so many people are paying attention right now. Now, I want to thank you for spending this time with me today. I appreciate you joining this session, and I hope this gives you a practical way to think about what is happening, why it matters, and how to respond inside your own organization. Now, for more insights, I encourage y'all to please subscribe to our Revenue Cycle Optimized podcast, as well as visit Infinix.com for more articles, case studies, and solution insights on all things RCM. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us. Subscribe to get notified when our next episode is online. For more information for how we can help you increase reimbursements at your company, check out our website at Infinix.com. That's INFINX.com.